reading this morning is from Gordon McKeeman. Gordon, or Bucky McKeeman, died this past year, but he had a long and distinguished career as a UU minister, originally a Universalist. In fact, he was one of the humiliati, this crowd of Universalist ministers that came out in the 1940s out of Crane Theological School in Tufts and went out to try to revive the denomination. This is his 2004. He was also president of Star King Ministry School out in California, our seminary in Berkeley. And this is his Star King President's lecture from 2004 at the Union General Assembly, looking backwards to the time of consolidation of the Unitarians and Universalists. He talked about how 2 or 3 years before 1961, which is when the consolidation happened, there has been a committee appointed from each denomination to work out the differences between them. They were already cooperating in religious education, but on publications and on publicity and things like that. But the committee never worked because neither denomination would give it any money. So it became apparent quite soon that gradualism as a method for effecting a merger was not going to work. At that juncture, the options seemed limited to two. Either return to the status quo ante, which meant abandoning the merger effort, or to forge or plunge ahead at all deliberate speed to a complete merger. While a few might prefer these former options, the latter course seemed best to the significant majority in both denominations. So we tried, under the pressure of an unworkable plan that had to be set to rights as soon as possible, to resolve the issue that the council had avoided. These were two in number, but comprehensive in scope. One was theological, the other was ecclesial. Ecclesial means it pertains to church setup, church organization. One was about our message, the other about our method. It is my purpose now to look more closely at these two issues, and this reading concentrates on the theological side. In the theological or doctrinal realm, both the Unitarians and Universalists had long histories. Both had arisen as varieties of Christianity. During the formative stage of Christianity, a variety of notions regarding it were put forward, without much regard to their fitting together and into a coherent body of doctrine or belief. Shortly after the year 300 of the Common Era, Christianity organized, regularized, and institutionalized. In the process, it developed its own cosmic story and began to declare heretical some of the early Christian ideas that did not fit with its story. Among these were Unitarian and Universalist Christianities. The Unitarian position focused in particular on the nature of Jesus. The emerging Christian orthodoxy considered Jesus to be a unique figure in human history, both human and divine, God's only Son. Unitarian Christians insisted that Jesus was fully human and not divine in any unique sense. Indeed, Unitarian Christians considered Jesus a paradigm of human possibility. The Universalist position addressed another part of the Orthodox Christian story. It did not share fully the Unitarian position. There were both Unitarian and Trinitarian Universalists. The Universalist position embraced universal salvation, characterized in a later Universalist statement of faith as, quote, the final harmony of all souls with God, unquote. For early Universalists, the description of God as love persuaded them that the Christian belief in partial salvation, the salvation of the saved, and the damnation to eternal punishment of the unregenerate did not square with the image of a God of love. This, too, was heresy. Heresies, of course, do not simply disappear when so labeled. They simply go underground, only to reappear in new forms, in new places, and under different circumstances. So the two heretical groups, Unitarian and Universalist, some still believing themselves to be Christians, but with a difference, were attempting to address the doctrinal issue. What we might have done, had we not been so pressured by the urgency to get the merger completed, was to have a theological discussion with the end in view of melding these two heresies into a cosmic story to which we might give common consent. It would also undergird our organizational efforts and our desires to make an impact on the cultures in which we live. Such a liberal doctrine, position, or faith, if you would combine the theological insights of Unitarianism regarding Jesus as an exemplar of human possibilities and potential, and the Universalist insights that we are all members of one human family and share a common destiny. Such a faith would be an alternative to Orthodox and evangelical Christianities and would, in addition, not alienate us from adherence to other world faiths. Almost 50 years later, we are struggling to resolve the question about our foundational faith, our cosmic story. Our sermon hymn, The Crescents Around the Chalice. What is the difference between a Unitarian and a Universalist? Some of you may want to know. In 1976, I first walked into a Unitarian Universalist church, the Unitarian Church in Charleston, and I fell in love with its stained glass windows, its Gothic arches, its hymn book and organ, and its lack of a creed. A long story, and one I have told often. For my purposes this morning, the important thing was that at the front of that church was an altar. On that altar was a symbol of the faith of that church at that time. And that symbol is one of the symbols of the front of your order of service today. Which symbol do you think it was? Which symbol was central to the Unitarian Church in Charleston in 1976? The middle one? Very good, very good. The answer is the one on the right. The cross. A standard brass Latin cross was on the altar. A visitor might easily think they'd stumbled into a Methodist or a Lutheran church. I don't believe there was a chalice at that time. The cross came off the altar in the mid-1980s when the Christian minister that was serving us was replaced by a humanist interim minister who declared he did not like to work in front of instruments of torture. So the cross, in compromise with some of the older members of the congregation, the cross was relegated to a historical shrine at the back of the church. Now focus on the quilt behind me today, made by the women of this church shortly after it was founded in 1996. What do you see when you look at that figure? Most of us will focus on the chalice itself. And many of us know the story of that chalice. It was a symbol of John Hus, the 15th century Czech reformer, who wanted to serve the communion chalice to all, and who was burned at the stake for his heresy. 6 centuries later, Hus's chalice with the flame of freedom was used by the Unitarian Service Committee as a recognition symbol in the Underground Railroad they set up in Czechoslovakia in 1939 to try to get Jews out ahead of the Nazis. So that's the story of the chalice, but the chalice is only part of this symbol. As important as the chalice are the two circles. These represent Unitarianism and Universalism, two separate denominations which decided in 1961 to consolidate. Some say merge, I say consolidate. The first thing you notice about them is that they are not concentric. They're off-center to each other. Now there's another symbol on the front of your order of service which is off-center. On the left you will see a circle with an off-center cross. That was a symbol devised in the 1940s by the Humiliati, a bunch of Universalist ministers, to express the idea that Universalism embraces Christianity but also a lot more, and that Christianity is not central to the Universalist faith. This off-center universalist idea then gets incorporated graphically after consolidation in the chalice with the two overlapping circles which adorns the wall behind me. Look more closely. There's a broad area of overlap in which the chalice is situated, but there are also two crescents, one on either side. One represents that part of universalism which is not contained within Unitarianism, and the other represents that part of Unitarianism which is not contained within Universalism. Do we feel we're back in algebra class studying set theory? This graphically illustrates that the coming together of Unitarian and Universalists is often called a merger, but there are significant parts that did not merge. We UUs tend to concentrate on what the two faiths held in common and ignore what are in the crescents. Today I want to talk about the crescents, what is unique to Universalism and what is unique to Unitarianism. Both faiths, of course, grew out of Christianity, and each set forth a vision of Jesus which was different from the Orthodox one, and claimed that their version was more consistent with the faith that Jesus preached. But they were significantly different from each other, as Gordon McKeeman summarized in the passage I read earlier. The difference in the role of Jesus is only the beginning. As Unitarians and Universalists fleshed out their theological approaches, other differences became evident. Hosea Ballou published his treatise on atonement in 1805, in which he disputed the notion central to Orthodox Christianity that Jesus' death on the cross was intended to atone for the sins of humankind. In the course of his analysis, Ballou affirmed a kind of determinism, which was similar to that of John Calvin, where God controlled and foreknew everything that had or would happen, and where human free will was an illusion, which sprang from our limited knowledge. The corresponding theological manifesto on the Unitarian side is William Ellery Channing's 1819 Baltimore sermon, Unitarian Christianity. In it, he set forth a view of Jesus as a great person, but not divine, and the great ethical example for people to emulate, what was later called salvation by character. While the Universalists insisted that all people would eventually be saved, the Unitarians took the position that whether you were saved in the next life depended on what you had done in this life, a position often called Arminianism, after a 16th century Dutch theologian named Jacobus Arminius. The two contrasting points of view can be seen in a remarkable debate between Ballou and Channing on the question of divine retribution. Both of these fathers of their respective faiths lived in Boston. Both were ministers of churches near Beacon Hill, and both were acknowledged as the leaders of their respective denominations. But so far as we know, they never met in person. The Brahmin Unitarians looked down on the lower class Universalists, and the fervor of Universalist evangelicalism looked to Unitarians too much like the Calvinist enthusiasm of the Great Awakening, which had birthed the movement of rational religion a century earlier, that movement being the precursor of Unitarian thought. Ballou himself was controversial even within Universalism, because he came to hold the position that there was to be no punishment in the afterlife whatsoever for the sins committed in this life, a position which was caricatured as death and glory Universalism. The more moderate view was that of the Restorationists, who held that the sinner would undergo a period of purgatory after death before ascending to heaven. In the Baltimore sermon, Channing does not dwell on sin, and he embraces a God full of mercy, but one who is capable of retribution. Quote, God's mercy as we understand it desires strongly the happiness of the guilty, but only through their penitence. It has a regard to character as truly as is his justice. It defers punishment and suffers long that the sinner may return to his duty, but leaves the impenitent and unyielding to the fearful retribution threatened in God's word. Ballou preached a God too loving to permit any retribution. Though Channing did not generally dwell on sin and punishment, In the early 1830s, he preached a sermon on sin, which has come down to us because it was included in a collection of his sermons. In that sermon, he took aim at the Universalists, particularly Ballou. After discussing how sin was its own punishment during the lifetime of the sinner, he went on to assert that sin is also punished in the afterlife. He then took on the Universalist view. Quote, this is Channing now. I know indeed that this doctrine is sometimes questioned. It is maintained by some among us that punishment is confined to the present state, that changing worlds we shall change our characters, that moral evil is to be buried with the body in the grave. As this opinion spreads industriously, and as it tends to diminish the dread of sin, it deserves some notice. To my mind, a more irrational doctrine was never broached. This is, remember, Channing talking about Ballou's Universalism. In the first place, it contradicts all our experience of the nature and laws of the mind. There is nothing more striking in the mind than the connection of its successive states. Our present knowledge, thoughts, feelings, characters are the result of former impressions, passions, and pursuits. We are this moment what the past has made us. And to suppose that at death the influences of our whole past course are to cease on our minds, and then the characters to spring up altogether at war with what has preceded it, is to suppose the most important law or principle of mind to be violated, is to destroy all analogy between the present and the future, and to substitute for experience the wildest dreams of fancy. In truth, such a sudden revolution in the character, as is here supposed, seems to destroy man's identity. The individual thus transformed can hardly seem to himself or to others the same being. It is equivalent to the creation of a new soul. Unquote. Channing was a prominent figure, and his sermon was printed in the newspaper, which gave Ballou a chance to write a book in order to refute it. One of his points is that Channing contradicts himself when at one point he argues that sin is its own punishment, and yet at another point says that much sin goes unpunished or even rewarded in this life, and thus for divine justice to work, there must be punishment in the next life. Ballou says that it doesn't help discourage sin when preachers are emphasizing how attractive and profitable sin can be in this life. To illustrate, Ballou cites a recent and notorious murder which had occurred in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1832. The body of a young woman who worked in a mill in that town had been found in a field. On autopsy, it was discovered that she was pregnant, though unmarried, and suspicion focused on a Methodist minister named Ephraim Avery, who was tried and then acquitted of the murder, though public opinion continued to hold that he had gotten her pregnant and killed her to save his reputation. Ballou was impressed that this preacher preached the doctrine of retribution for sin in the next life, but that doctrine would not have been enough to deter him from murder if he in fact committed it. Quote, look now at the facts of the case. Of what benefit was the doctrine of future punishment to the man who had so long preached it and who committed the murder? Again, of what use was the fear of punishment in this world to him who flattered himself that he could commit the murder and yet screen himself for the penalty of the law? It was not in the power of the fear of future punishment, nor of punishment from the law of the lands, to prevent the crime. But had that man been half as fearful of committing that crime as he was of being found out and punished according to the law, the poor girl whose fate we deplore would not have lost her life by his hands. Unquote. But more than that, Ballou takes on Channing's principle of analogy, that the afterlife must be somewhat like our present life. If this is so, Ballou argues, then not only would the wicked persist in their wickedness, but the good Christian would persist in his efforts to reform the wicked. But if the wicked are set in eternal torment, what are the good to do once they're in heaven? Are they to cease caring about the souls of the sinner? Are they even going to enjoy the torments of the sinner? Ballou concludes, in taking a general view of this weighty subject, it seems impossible to avoid surprise at the zeal which is manifested in support of the doctrine which carries sin and misery into the future state, but resigns at death all those holy feelings, those heavenly compassions, and those merciful desires, which in this world engage the saints in the blessed cause of bringing sinners to repentance. Finding a stream so broad, so deep, and so rapid, it is natural to inquire for the fountain from which it flows. Does it flow from that God who is love? Can infinite love take pleasure in continuing sin beyond this mortal state, and in discontinuing those compassions and that heavenly mercy which so kindly flow towards the unhappy guilty in this world? In reasoning thus, do we reason from analogy? No, we contradict analogy. This Channing-Ballou exchange gives you a small flavor of the differences between Unitarian and Universalist in theology in the 1830s. The most profound difference, of course, was not in divine retribution, but in the question of free will. In any moral scheme, punishment only makes sense if the actor has free will. In our criminal law, we don't punish a person who commits a crime under the compulsion of another, or while sleepwalking, or out of a mental illness. Punishment only makes sense if a person has the choice to do good or bad and freely chooses to do bad. Thus, the Universalist belief that everything is determined by God, that free will is an illusion, is consistent with the belief that God does not subject the wicked to eternal torment. But these philosophical differences faded in importance over time. A lot of Universalists abandoned the idea of divine determinism, and more importantly, a lot of Unitarians and a few Universalists abandoned the belief in God altogether. Unitarians accepted humanist ministers as early as the 19-teens, and there was one Universalist minister who signed the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's great contribution to philosophical theory is the notion of the dialectic, where you have an idea called the thesis, which generates its opposite, called the antithesis, and these two struggle together, and out of that struggle is born a new idea, a synthesis, which then generates its new antithesis. This has always seemed to be the way that the history of ideas work, like a two-legged person on stilts trying to walk a straight line. The arguments do not stay the same down through the centuries, but shift as the struggle continues. We still have liberals and conservatives today, but they don't argue about communism taking over the world or nuclear arms. Unitarians and Universalists consolidate without ever working out their theoretical differences. It should not surprise us that we have a hard time discovering a coherent message today. Fortunately, we do not have to decide today whether we live in one crescent or the other or somewhere in the middle. I draw my own inspiration from the best of Universalism and Unitarianism. Certainly the Transcendentalists come from our Unitarian side. But if we're going to try to have a coherent message to the outside world, we have to understand the contradictions within our own history as we select which strands to incorporate in our ongoing pilgrimage. Amen.